So we've learnt about how a food chain can show what eats what in an ecosystem, but what we've discovered is that ecosystems are much more complicated than just a single food chain. Ecosystems are complex. And one way that scientists have used to show how complex ecosystems are is to draw a food web instead of a food chain. And we can see a food web here. Food webs show much more than just one species eating another, because we've discovered that in an ecosystem, lots of species eat lots of other different types of species. So looking at our food web here, we'll go through each of the different types of producer and consumer to see what a food web shows. So let's start off with our producer. And producers, as we learnt before, are always the plants in the ecosystem. They produce their own food and they get energy from the sun. But looking here, instead of a food chain where only one species ate the plant, now we can see that 4 different species eat this producer. So when we look at our first order consumers, which are the herbivores, the animals that eat plants, we can see here that we have the grub is a first order consumer, and the aphid is, and the snail, and up here, small animals like mice and other rodents are all first order consumers. And if we follow the arrows along, we'll look for the second order consumers, which are the animals that eat the herbivores. So following along from the grub, we can see the small bird eats the grubs. That means it's a second order consumer. The bird also eats the snail. And the beetle eats aphids, so it's a second order consumer as well. And looking up at the small animals, the large bird, like this bird of prey here, it eats the small animals, so it's a second order consumer as well. Now we'll look at third order consumers. These are animals that prey on other animals, so they're carnivores too. So we're looking for what eats the second order consumers. So what eats a beetle? It's the large bird. And what eats the small birds? The large bird again. So actually, sometimes a species can be a second and a third order consumer at the same time. And that's not unusual because we can see how complicated a food web can be sometimes. So the main idea to learn from that is that food webs show many different interactions all at the same time. Food webs show many interactions. The next thing to think about is we can actually make a food chain, or we can see a food chain in every food web. For example, if we look at the food web from scratch again, if we start with our plants, the plants are eaten by the snail is eaten by the small bird, and the small bird is eaten by the large bird. So if we join these 4 species together, we can see there's one food chain inside a food web. But on the other hand, we could have gone from the plants to the aphid, and then to the beetle, and then to the large bird. So here is a second food web. Sorry, a second food chain in our food web. So food chains can be found inside a food web. Or in other words, a food web is made of lots of food chains all joined together. One final thing to talk about is what do fungi, such as mushrooms and other fungi that live on logs, what role do they play in an ecosystem? Because they're not a producer, they still need to get energy from other living things. But actually, what fungi do is get their energy from dead organisms. And we call them decomposers. Because they grow on any type of dead organism and they break it down and get their energy from that part of the living thing. So in every food web, we can always imagine that there is a group of decomposers that will be eating every other living thing in the web once it dies. So every other living thing can be eaten at the end.